Stereotypes. It's like this dirty word when it comes to psychology. I mean, ask any social psychologist and they're gonna tell you that all stereotypes are terrible, negative, totally untrue assumptions about a group of people. But is this actually the case in psychology? Are stereotypes really this terrible thing that they're cracked up to be? I mean, why do they exist in the first place? Could they actually, heaven forbid, be useful in some way? That's what we're going to talk about in today's video. I mean, look, I get stereotyped all the time. I'm a psychologist and I'm a woman, so people constantly think that I am analyzing them, trying to figure them out. Maybe that sometimes I can be too emotional or even ditzy at times, and yeah, okay, some of this is totally true about me, but some of the other things, maybe not so much. And the same can be said for other stereotypes as well. So as we're gonna see in this video, sometimes stereotypes are totally unhelpful, they completely mislead us, but then other times, maybe stereotypes actually can be useful. So what is a stereotype? Well, it kind of depends on what type of psychologist you ask, I'm not gonna lie. But just as a general rule of thumb, a stereotype can be thought of as an assumption about a group. So what somebody in a specific group is supposed to be like. You get stereotypes of all sorts of different types of groups. So, for example, as an American person, I would probably get stereotyped as being really loud and obnoxious. And you also get stereotypes for other things, like people of different genders, or races, or backgrounds. The list goes on and on. If you have a group of people, there's probably going to be a stereotype about them. Now, according to social psychologists, all stereotypes are these terrible negative things because they are built on assumptions, right? And according to this type of psychology, stereotypes come about through prejudice and bias and all of these negative assumptions about groups. So, for example, the media might portray a certain group in a very exaggerated and unfavorable type of way. That would be considered a negative stereotype. And these types of stereotypes are not really based in any sort of fact. There might be a kernel of truth to them, but then they are completely overblown into something that is just totally untrue about someone. These stereotypes are usually very negative, they're not very favorable, they're not very nice. They may be very politically motivated, so they're placed there to display that group in an unfavorable way. And they're just not helpful when we're actually trying to figure somebody out. If we went on this stereotype, it would actually make us less accurate when we're trying to figure that person out. So that's how social psychologists view stereotypes. Kind of where stereotypes are just never a good thing, they're always bad, they're always negative, they're never helpful. Now let's turn the page. Let's look at how personality psychologists see stereotypes, because this is very different now. And this is also something that you're probably not going to learn about in any intro to psychology textbook. So according to personality psychologists, a stereotype is what the average person in a group is supposed to be like. Or at least that's sort of our assumption going in, right? A stereotype can still be thought of as an assumption, but it's supposed to represent the average person of a specific group. So it's supposed to tell us something about that particular group. So for example, how would you characterize the average American woman? What do they look like? How do they behave? What are some just average characteristics of that type of person? How would you stereotype the average psychologist? How would you stereotype the average white girl? Right? There's all these different types of groups that I personally could belong to that you could make a stereotype about. Now here's the thing, in personality psychology, stereotypes are not necessarily going to be negative. Some could be more neutral or even positive. All it's supposed to do is tell you something about that particular group. So yeah, it is a generalization, but it's supposed to be helpful. They're not always helpful, as we're going to talk about, but stereotypes are supposed to be helpful, according to personality psychology. And if a stereotype is actually accurate, it could actually be helpful if you're trying to make an assessment of someone. But it actually has to be an accurate stereotype. That's the caveat. So in terms of the question whether stereotypes are always bad, well, the answer is no. Sometimes they're bad if the stereotype just isn't true about a group. But if a stereotype is based in something that's factual, that actually says something about a group, then it can be helpful. But why do stereotypes exist at all? If there are these downsides, why don't we just take people as they come and make an assessment of someone for who they are? Well, psychology can answer this question as well. Here's the thing. As a human being, you need quick ways to be able to make interpretations of all sorts of things in your world. If you had to evaluate everything for what it was, very slowly and methodically, without using previous information to help you in those perceptions, things would take way too long. I'm sorry, it just would not work. You need some level of efficiency in your perceptions to kind of speed things along so that you can, get on with your life. You cannot be spending minutes upon minutes or hours upon hours trying to make an assessment of something, and the same is true for people. There are these mental shortcuts that help speed along the process of making a perception or a decision about somebody who you're just meeting. And stereotypes can be thought of as one of those mental shortcuts. They're made to speed along the process so that you can make a quicker assessment of someone. Or if you're going into a conversation or a social situation where you don't know anything about the person, well, okay, maybe an accurate stereotype could help you initially. And while social psychology tries to make stereotypes out as always being the result of prejudice and bias, here's the thing. Even if you're not biased toward a group, you're still going to have a stereotype. It's just how our brains work. Not all stereotypes are based in negative assumptions. Stereotypes exist because we need mental shortcuts. It's just how your brain is wired as a person. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Keep in mind, though, that stereotypes do not necessarily tell you about an individual person. They say something, hopefully accurately, about a group of people, but not necessarily about each individual person. You can have an individual in a group who is nothing like the stereotype of that group, and you have to be able to recognize that and then update your perceptions pretty quickly. Not everyone's going to fit into a nice tiny little box of what the average person is like. How do you know which stereotypes are helpful and which aren't? Well, it's a tricky question. You can kind of look at where that stereotype comes from. So if it's just a media portrayal, I would probably not use that stereotype. I would just chuck it right out the window. Bye-bye, not helpful. If it's a stereotype that I myself have formed through personal interactions or outside observations of a group, then that stereotype might actually be helpful. But it's not a stereotype in the way that social psychologists would make it out to be. It's more just what the average person in that group might be like based on your own observations of them. So to sum it all up, while certain stereotypes do have some advantages when it comes to being able to make quick interpretations of people, you should not solely rely on them. There is really something to be said for actually getting to know somebody and talking to them and interacting with them and asking them questions about themselves. And that is something that a stereotype, no matter how accurate that stereotype is, simply cannot replace, because a stereotype does not tell you about the individual person that you are talking to. So that wraps things up. Please go ahead and give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.